If you've ever heard of the film Zardoz, then it's very likely one thing comes to mind: Sean Connery in a leather loincloth. Zardoz has become a little-known cult film, a strange blend of the surreal with post-apocalyptic society and a large helping of fumbling sexuality. I've done what I can to peel back the layers and find out how this odd film ever came to be, although given the length of time and the obscurity of the film information, well, it includes a lot of detective work, biased sources, and attempts to try to fill in the blanks. The involvement of the great actor, who was supposedly named by People magazine as Sexiest Man of the Century in 1999, came about because of Connery's problems with his most famous role. I'm speaking, of course, of James Bond. Connery's feelings, well, it was an inverse relationship with that of the public. The more they loved his James Bond, the more he hated the role. Michael Caine said that you didn't discuss Bond with Connery. He was so touchy about the subject, he would just become incensed. After 5 films, he'd had enough and left the role behind. But after only one more Bond film with a new actor in the role, United Artists found itself looking for a replacement for the replacement. Many were considered, including Burt Reynolds, but he turned it down because he felt Bond needed to be played by someone British. So finally, in desperation, the management said, "Get Connery back for Diamonds Are Forever. Money is not an object here." Even with that, Connery was reluctant to go back to the role, fearful of typecasting. And thus it included not only an enormous salary, but United Artists had to back 2 films of Connery's choosing afterwards. This would ensure that he would have some guaranteed work that could allow him to show more range. The first film was The Offense, a critically praised box office dud, where Connery was a cop who killed, while in police custody, a man who was accused of raping a child. The second was a film adaptation of Macbeth, with an all-Scottish cast, although sadly the project fell through as another Macbeth film was actually in the works, made by, ironically given the subject matter of The Offense, Roman Polanski. As for Burt Reynolds, he appeared in a film by John Boorman called Deliverance. That landmark film was a critical success and a box office hit, ensuring that, as Roger Ebert noted, Boorman was effectively guaranteed that whatever he wanted to do next, he could. What he'd been interested in was an adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, but after working on it for some time, United Artists started getting cold feet about the expense of such an adaptation. The project was eventually abandoned, though some of the work that he did on that would be used in the film Excalibur. What Boorman finally decided to do was to create a film from 2 dissimilar stories. One was the classic L. Frank Baum story made famous by Julie Garland, The Wizard of Oz. The other was indeed about as far as you might think from the fantasy of Oz. It was the writing of Aldous Huxley. Huxley's most famous work is the classic dystopian novel Brave New World, the 1984 before 1984. But what in particular inspired Boorman was After Many a Summer, a novel set, appropriately, in Hollywood. It's the tale of an aging Hollywood millionaire, approaching the end of his life and researching a way to cheat death. It was a story to mock the worst aspects of American culture in Huxley's mind, an obsession with youth, the superficial, and the out-of-control narcissism that was on display. The immortal discovered in the book is based upon theories regarding neoteny at the time, which is the reason that the immortal has the appearance of an ape. What Boorman conceived was of a post-apocalyptic society set in the year 2293, and exploring the idea of what would happen to a society with immortality. He envisioned a culture where no further children were needed, and so sexuality collapsed, a passionless society without sleep, only meditation. As a result, the original generation cannot cope and are forced to age to the point of senility, as are all others who push back against the order of things. Yet many would push back, he reasoned, having no stimulation to live for, at most enjoying the brutality of those outside their contained world as a diversion. And from them would emerge our main character, to bring a new chaos into this place that is so rigid even their language is formalized. The actor Boorman had in mind to play this man, Zed, was Burt Reynolds. They'd worked well together on Deliverance. Alas, Reynolds proved unavailable, which was how Sean Connery ties into things. He was looking for something that would again distance himself from the role of Bond, and Zed was certainly that. So intrigued by the idea of the weird screenplay, Connery accepted the part for a mere $200,000, which nevertheless was 1/5 of the production budget for the entire film. But considering what he could get for Bond, that was peanuts. In fact, Connery offered Borman to drive himself rather than having a driver hired if Borman would pay half of the driver's fee to him instead. To save further expense, he stayed in Borman's home the entire time, and according to Borman, he was the perfect guest, the ultimate gentleman. He was polite, he was a brilliant man, and after dinner, he would quietly retire to his room and write poetry. Just in case you didn't think he was sexy enough. Well, as I said, Borman was in a great position after the success of Deliverance, and so 20th Century Fox helped back Borman's new company that was going to make this film, which he hoped to shoot entirely in Ireland. It was going to be complicated, though. With such a small budget, the science fiction film was going to have to depend a great deal upon practical special effects and camera trickery, a more theatrical setup than you typically see in a science fiction work. The most complex problem was the image of Zardoz itself, a giant stone head. There was no model department to handle that, so they built a large head and moved it about suspended from a crane, so that it would appear to be flying about and impressing the brutals of the world, and give the exterminators like Zed their guns and ammunition to slaughter in the name of Zardoz. This is going to be a problem for the production. Guns were an important element of the film, as violence and death were one of the key themes. And it's also quite clear that the gun is chosen as the weapon because he wanted an allegory for the penis. Swords or arrows are just not going to cut it in this work. There's a special symbolism around guns. Except at this time, the IRA was heavily involved in terrorist activities, and it was feared that the guns Borman would import for the film could wind up being diverted and end up in the hands of the IRA, no matter how much Borman assured the authorities that they were going to be careful. Well, hilariously, a member of the crew told Borman that if this was a problem, he could sort it out. He could get Borman all the guns he needed for the film. "How can you do that?" Borman asked. "I'm in the IRA," the man explained. "We have more guns than we know what to do with." In the end, they were able to import weapons rather than having terrorists provide them for the film, which was probably for the best. Well, speaking of the revolution, Borman had an interesting encounter with communists after the film was finished. Their French newspaper was going to give this film a good review, which Borman's film desperately needed. But the masks worn by the exterminators in many shots were red and had faces on them, and they were afraid that this was intended to be Lenin. Borman had to sign a document swearing that the masks were not Lenin before they published their review of the film, lest they be seen endorsing a film that was mocking a revered communist figure. Connery was a real professional on the film, but there was some resistance to a couple of the elements. The masculine icon tried to get out of the scene that required Zed to disguise himself as a bride to slip past the mob, but he was finally convinced to grudgingly do it. The other is that Connery has an intense dislike for things being put on his skin. This was especially problematic on this film because Borman perceived that the ending should show Connery aging naturally in the same location so that more and more old age makeup would be applied while the camera recorded it. The process was torture for Connery, and it took an entire day just to film the sequence. And then, at the wrap party, Borman was informed that the lab called. That segment of the film was scratched and unusable, so it was going to have to be filmed all over again. Connery was not pleased, especially because they shot it the next day when everyone was hungover from the wrap party. So, another entire day spent that Connery hated every minute of. It was finally over, though. Then Borman came up and said, "Sorry, Sean, we screwed up and we'll have to do it a third time." Connery laughed hard at the joke until he saw Borman wasn't laughing. Apparently, the hungover camera assistant accidentally opened the can, exposing the film stock and ruining it. Connery was so outraged they had to physically restrain him. The look on his face suggested he was going to pummel the camera assistant into the ground for making him do it a third time. So ashamed was the assistant that he left Ireland entirely, and eventually ran into Borman again when he was working as a DP making commercials in Hollywood. When the film was completed, the feedback was as many feared. the film was impenetrable to many in the audience. To salvage this, Boorman filmed a scene where the character of Arthur Frayne, the magician of the piece, explained things to the audience at the start of the film. This, however, did nothing to make people any less confused, cementing the film's reception as a dud. Boorman admits this was in part down to his own hubris and self-indulgence on the picture, though, as mentioned, it remains a cult classic in the minds of some. So, let's take a look at this surreal adventure, Zardoz.